The courtroom buzzed with anticipation. Today was the day that everyone had been waiting for. It wasn't just any trial. This was the trial of a lifetime. Lionel Richie, the legendary pop star, was in the hot seat, and the courtroom was packed with people eager to see how this would unfold. The stakes were high. It wasn't just about the legal battle, it was about reputation, pride, and everything that Lionel had worked for. On the opposite side, there was a lawyer known for his ruthless tactics. He was a man who had built a career out of winning no matter the cost. His name was Michael Graves, and he was feared in the courtroom. With his sharp suit and cold demeanor, Graves had a way of making even the toughest opponents crumble. His reputation as a heartless, calculating lawyer had earned him respect and fear. He wasn't here to make friends, he was here to win. Today he was facing off against a man who had spent decades creating timeless music, but now, Lionel Richie found himself defending something far more important than just his career. The tension in the room was thick. The judge, stern and serious, called the court to order, and the trial began. The first words out of Graves' mouth were laced with mockery, and it was clear from the start that this wasn't going to be just another case. The ruthless lawyer was ready to tear Lionel apart, but what he didn't know was that something in this courtroom was about to change everything. The moment Graves stood up, the entire room fell silent. He was ready to strike. His voice was smooth, almost too smooth, like he was preparing to dissect Lionel piece by piece. He glanced at the judge, who gave him a slight nod, signaling it was time to begin his cross-examination. "Mr. Richie," Graves began, his voice oozing with sarcasm, "tell me, how does it feel to be a has-been in a world that's moved on? I mean, your heyday was in the 80s. A little out of touch, wouldn't you say?" He raised an eyebrow as if waiting for the crowd's reaction, enjoying every second of the discomfort he was causing. Lionel's face remained calm, but a slight tension in his jaw betrayed his nerves. He'd been through many interviews and public moments, but this felt different. This was an attack. Graves wasn't here to ask about the case. He was here to make Lionel look small, irrelevant. The courtroom could feel it. Graves continued, his tone sharp. "Your songs are nice, I suppose, but they haven't exactly been chart toppers for the last few decades, have they?" He smirked as he paced back and forth. "Maybe it's time to accept that your time is over, Mr. Richie." The lawyer's words were meant to wound, to belittle. He was hoping Lionel would snap, hoping the pop star would show a crack in his polished image. The audience in the courtroom leaned in, eager for a reaction. But Lionel, though clearly uncomfortable, didn't flinch. His hands were still, and his gaze never left Graves. He was silent, taking it all in, knowing that this was just part of the game. As Graves continued his mocking, the room grew colder. It wasn't just Lionel who felt the sting of the lawyer's words. The jury, sitting just a few feet away, seemed to shift in their seats, uncomfortable with what they were witnessing. The sharpness of Graves' tone, the deliberate cruelty in his words, it was too much, even for a courtroom. The camera would have caught the slight furrows on the faces of some jurors, expressions that whispered they were starting to question the fairness of this cross-examination. A few of them glanced at each other, as if wondering if they were the only ones feeling uneasy. One juror, a middle-aged man with glasses, shook his head slightly, as if trying to process what he was hearing. He couldn't hide the disapproval in his eyes. But it was the younger woman juror, sitting towards the end of the row, who made the most obvious reaction. She clenched her fists under the table, her knuckles turning white. Her face was a mix of confusion and disbelief, as though she couldn't understand why Graves was going so far. Lionel Richie wasn't just some celebrity on trial, he was a man who had brought joy to millions through his music. And here was this lawyer, trying to tear him down in front of everyone. Her discomfort didn't go unnoticed. She exchanged a glance with another juror, a man in his early 40s, who nodded in agreement. The two of them seemed to silently support each other, as if a quiet, unspoken bond was forming between them over their shared reaction to Graves' behavior. It wasn't just them, even the older jurors, who had seen their fair share of cases, looked uneasy. This was more than just a legal case. This was becoming personal. And Graves, for all his confidence, didn't seem to notice the shift. Or maybe he didn't care. He was still trying to tear Lionel apart, unaware that he was losing the jury, piece by piece. After a long moment of silence, Lionel finally spoke. It wasn't with anger, nor was it a rebuttal. It was calm, measured, and surprisingly genuine. He leaned forward slightly, his voice steady but full of quiet conviction. "Mr. Graves," Lionel began, his eyes locking onto the lawyer's, "you're right about one thing. My heyday may have been in the 80s, but my music has always been about more than just charts or numbers. It's about the people who've connected with it." Graves raised an eyebrow, clearly not expecting such a calm response. He was ready for Lionel to lash out, to try and defend himself with flashy words or a witty comeback. But what came next was something entirely different. Lionel spoke about the power of music, the way it could lift someone out of their darkest moments, how it could make people feel understood, no matter where they came from. "I've met people who've told me that my songs helped them get through tough times, helped them find hope. And that, Mr. Graves, is something I'll never regret. That's why I'm still here." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't try to throw insults back at Graves. He simply spoke from the heart, as though the words were coming straight from his soul. The courtroom, which had been tense and uncomfortable just moments ago, seemed to hold its breath. Even the judge seemed to take notice of Lionel's unexpected grace. Graves stood there, momentarily taken aback, his mouth opening and closing, as if trying to find something to say. But there was nothing. Lionel's calm confidence had diffused the tension in a way that Graves couldn't have predicted. The lawyer, who had been so sure of himself, now found himself speechless. The jury's eyes were now focused entirely on Lionel. It wasn't just a celebrity in front of them anymore, it was a man who had shared a piece of his heart, and in that moment, they began to understand something. Lionel Richie wasn't just some washed-up pop star, he was a man whose legacy was built on more than fame. It was built on something deeper. Graves wasn't ready for this. He had spent years perfecting his skills, using mockery and insults to break his opponents. But Lionel Richie had thrown him off balance. The smug confidence that Graves had walked in with was now slipping away, and he was starting to sense the shift in the room. He tried to regain control, shifting his focus back to the case. "Well, Mr. Richie," Graves sneered, "let's not get too sentimental. This trial isn't about your music career or what fans think. It's about facts, evidence, and the law. So let's stick to the facts, shall we?" But even as he spoke, something had changed. The jury was no longer paying full attention to him. The younger woman juror, the one who had been so visibly upset by Graves' earlier mockery, now sat with a look of quiet determination on her face. She didn't look away from Lionel, her eyes filled with respect for his response. It was as if in that moment, she had made up her mind. The cold, calculated lawyer had lost her support. Graves noticed her gaze but chose to ignore it, continuing his aggressive questioning. Yet the jury's body language was telling a different story. The older jurors, who had been indifferent before, now seemed more engaged, leaning forward ever so slightly, their faces less harsh. Even the middle-aged man with glasses, who had been shaking his head earlier, now seemed to consider Lionel's words with more depth. Graves couldn't help but feel the shift. He pushed harder, determined to maintain control, but his voice didn't have the same force. It lacked the sharpness it had before. The more he pushed, the more the jury pulled away, as if they could sense that Lionel was right, that this wasn't about mocking a man's career, but about something far more meaningful. And as Graves continued, the weight of the courtroom seemed to fall onto him. He was no longer the dominant figure. Lionel Richie was. As the trial continued, it became more and more clear that the dynamics in the room had changed. Graves, once confident and sharp, now seemed like a man desperately clinging to his control. His attempts to belittle Lionel had faltered, and instead of gaining the jury's favor, he was losing them. One by one, the jurors' faces were shifting. The younger woman juror, who had earlier shown clear discomfort, was now quietly nodding to herself. Her eyes had softened, and her earlier tension had faded. She no longer looked upset, instead she looked thoughtful, as if Lionel's words had hit a deeper chord than anyone expected. She glanced at the other jurors, her gaze meeting that of the middle-aged man who had shaken his head earlier. He gave a small subtle nod in return. The two jurors, silently agreeing on something, seemed to have formed a quiet shared understanding. And it wasn't just them. The older jurors, those who had once seemed indifferent to the back and forth, were now leaning slightly forward, giving Lionel more attention. Some even exchanged subtle glances, as if acknowledging the calm strength he had shown. Graves' harsh words no longer seemed to carry the same weight. The more he pressed Lionel, the more it seemed to backfire. He had tried to turn the courtroom against the pop star, but instead, he was alienating the very people who mattered most, the jury. Lionel's response had done more than just defend his career, it had won the jury over piece by piece. Graves, sensing the change, tried to push even harder. He spoke faster, his voice rising slightly in frustration, but the jurors weren't buying it anymore. They weren't paying attention to the lawyer's words as much as they were to his tone, which was growing more desperate. His polished facade was cracking. The harshness in his voice had made him sound less like a skilled lawyer, and more like a bully. And all the while, Lionel remained calm. He didn't raise his voice or fight back with insults. He simply stood his ground, unwavering, while the jury continued to shift their allegiance. The courtroom had become a battleground, and Lionel Richie was slowly but surely winning it. The trial was drawing to a close, and the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Lionel sat quietly, his hands resting on the table, a sense of calm surrounding him. He had faced so much mockery, personal attacks, and relentless questioning, but now, he seemed more composed than ever. The jury was deliberating, their eyes no longer focused on the lawyers, but on the man who had stood before them with nothing but truth in his heart. Across the room, Graves stood with his arms crossed, his face taut with frustration. He had been so certain of his victory just hours ago, but now he was pacing restlessly, his confidence shaken. He could feel it, the shift. The jury was no longer on his side, the smug smirk that had once defined him was gone, replaced with a nervous edge that he couldn't hide. The jurors were quiet. The older man with glasses, who had shaken his head earlier, exchanged a glance with the younger woman juror, whose face now seemed softened, thoughtful. They had made their minds up. Their expressions were no longer indifferent, they were filled with quiet determination, as if they knew where their duty lay. Lionel's calm strength had convinced them, piece by piece, that Graves' tactics had no place in this courtroom. Lionel sat back in his chair, his expression neutral, but his mind focused. He had said what he needed to say, and now it was in the jury's hands. He wasn't worried about the outcome, not because he was overconfident, but because he knew he had fought with integrity. He had let his words speak for themselves, and now it was up to the jurors to make their decision. The minutes ticked by slowly. The judge watched closely, sensing the weight of the decision that lay ahead. Lionel and Graves exchanged no words. The battle had been fought, but now the real test was in the hands of 12 strangers, who would decide not just the fate of the trial, but the fate of the reputation that had been at the heart of it all.